I savored the perfect silence that fell over the Harrington family's lavish dining room as my granddaughter Melissa's face drained of color. The moment when all 35 distinguished dinner guests learned that the old-fashioned grandmother, relegated to kitchen duty and denied a seat at the table, had actually funded their entire culinary empire and still owned controlling interest in every restaurant bearing their name. Some lessons about respecting your elders can't be taught with gentle reminders alone. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I, Margaret Eleanor Caldwell, was never supposed to have a place in the culinary world. Born in 1953 in the struggling coal town of Pinecrest, Pennsylvania, I entered a world where restaurant ownership was something we glimpsed in magazines, not something we experienced in our daily lives. Our neighborhood consisted of modest homes occupied by miners, factory workers, and shopkeepers, hard-working people who measured worth not by what they owned, but by the integrity with which they lived their lives. My father, Richard Caldwell, worked punishing shifts at the Pinecrest coal mine. He would return home each evening, his face blackened with coal dust, his shoulders stooped from hours of work in the cramped tunnels beneath our town. Despite the physical toll, he never complained. "The work is hard," he'd say, "but it lets me give you children something better than I had." My mother, Evelyn, transformed our simple two-bedroom house on Maple Street into a place where anyone, experiencing hardship, could find comfort and a hot meal. She had been a schoolteacher before marrying my father, one of the few women in our town with a college education, though she gave up formal employment to raise me and my younger brothers. Robert and Thomas, she never stopped being an educator and provider. "True wealth isn't what's in your wallet," my mother would say, her hands efficiently transforming humble ingredients into meals that could feed a dozen people. "It's what you understand about how to create value from what you have." This philosophy guided our family's approach to everything from household finances to community involvement. Pinecrest in the 1960s was a town struggling to adapt as the mining industry began its slow decline. Our street, Elm Avenue, was lined with nearly identical company-built homes, each with a small patch of yard and a front porch where neighbors gathered on summer evenings. The Mitchells lived to our left. Frank worked alongside my father in the mine. The Sullivans lived to our right. Sean worked at the lumber mill, and Margaret, whom I was named after, ran a small bakery from their front room. These neighbors formed an extended family, each household contributing what skills and resources they had to our collective survival. When I was 9, the mine reduced operations during a labor dispute, cutting everyone to 3-day weeks. I watched as neighbors helped neighbors, trading childcare for home repairs, garden vegetables for baking lessons. What outsiders might have seen as hardship, we experienced as interdependence, a community adapting together to circumstances beyond individual control. My childhood was shaped by watching my parents plan carefully for the future despite limited means. I observed my mother preserve vegetables from our garden to feed us through winter. In August, our kitchen would transform into a steamy workshop as mason jars filled with tomatoes, green beans, and pickles. Nothing was wasted, even apple cores, and peels were turned into jelly or vinegar. "Waste is just ignorance made visible," my mother would say as she transformed scraps into usable resources. This practical wisdom shaped my understanding of value long before I encountered formal business theory. I watched my father repair our home and help neighbors with theirs. "Fix it right the first time, Maggie," he'd tell me as I handed him tools, "and you won't have to fix it again next year." This lesson in quality over expedience would guide my approach throughout my life. In Pinecrest, where resources were scarce, durability wasn't a luxury. It was a necessity. Most importantly, I witnessed how my parents managed resources with disciplined intention rather than impulsive desires. Payday in our household followed a ritual that never varied. At the kitchen table, my mother would carefully divide my father's earnings into labeled envelopes: mortgage, groceries, utilities, church, savings, and education. The education envelope, though often the thinnest, was treated with particular reverence. "This is your future, Maggie. And Bobby's and Tommy's, too," my mother would say, placing $1 or sometimes just coins into the envelope. "It might not look like much today, but over time, it will grow into something significant." Each December, my mother would open the education envelope and show us how the small weekly contributions had accumulated. Then she would take us to the Pinecrest Savings and Loan to deposit the sum into our college accounts. The teller, Mrs. Henderson, would update our passbook with the new balance and calculate the interest earned. "Look at that, Margaret," Mrs. Henderson would say, pointing to the interest column. "That's money you didn't have to work for. That's your money working for you." The concept of passive income fascinated me even before I had language to describe it. While most adults in Pinecrest worked physically demanding jobs where income was directly tied to hours worked, Mrs. Henderson was introducing a fundamentally different economic model where initial resources could multiply through strategic positioning, rather than continued effort. Beyond these financial lessons, my mother taught me something even more valuable: the power of cooking to bring people together. She could transform the humblest ingredients, root vegetables, tough cuts of meat, day-old bread, into meals that not only nourished our bodies, but fed our spirits. "Cooking isn't just about feeding people," she would tell me as I stood beside her at the stove. "It's about creating moments that matter, memories that last long after the plates are cleared." I learned to cook by my mother's side, absorbing not just techniques, but an entire philosophy about food and hospitality. These lessons about resourcefulness, creating value, and bringing people together would eventually form the foundation of a culinary empire that no one could have imagined growing from the coal dust of Pinecrest. By age 14, I had developed a reputation in our neighborhood for my baking skills. I started selling bread and pies to supplement our family income, using a portion of my father's garden shed as a makeshift bakery. The old wood-burning stove we salvaged from a neighbor's remodel became my first commercial oven, and my mother's recipes, refined through years of necessity and creativity, became the basis for products that neighbors would line up to purchase each weekend. The rhythms of baking became the soundtrack of my adolescence, the thump of dough being kneaded, the scrape of the wooden spoon against the mixing bowl, the gentle ticking of the timer as crusty loaves and flaky pies transformed from raw ingredients to neighborhood treasures. I quickly learned which variations would sell best at different times. Cinnamon bread on Saturdays when families wanted a special weekend breakfast, savory meat pies on Thursdays when paychecks were running low and people needed substantial but affordable meals. While other teenagers spent their earnings on records and movies, I divided mine with methodical precision. 25% for immediate needs, 25% for short-term goals, and 50% always went to my future fund, the untouchable savings that represented possibilities beyond Pinecrest. The discipline required to maintain this system sometimes tested my resolve. When the traveling fair came to Pinecrest during the summer of 1968, I declined joining friends on the rides, knowing the $5 required would deplete my immediate fund. Susan Thompson, whose father managed the town's only department store, couldn't comprehend my reluctance. "Your parents could just give you more if you run out," she said, confusion evident in her expression. "That's not how it works in my family," I replied, unable to fully articulate the fundamental difference in our economic worldviews. At 15, I couldn't explain that her approach assumed abundance and safety nets I knew didn't exist in my reality. By the time I graduated high school in 1971, my little bakery operation had grown enough to fund my first year at the state college, something unimaginable for most girls from Pinecrest. I was the first in my family to attend college, studying business administration while working in the university cafeteria to gain more commercial kitchen experience. College opened my eyes to a world of culinary possibilities beyond the practical. Home cooking of Pinecrest. I took every opportunity to learn about different cuisines, borrowing cookbooks from the library and experimenting in my tiny apartment kitchen. I discovered that my background in stretching ingredients and minimizing waste gave me an advantage over classmates who had grown up with abundance. I could create magnificent meals on a student budget, while they floundered with expensive ingredients they didn't know how to properly utilize. During my junior year, I began catering small faculty events, using the money to invest in better equipment and ingredients. Word spread about the student who could create sophisticated menus at reasonable prices, and by my senior year, I was catering alumni functions and departmental gatherings. Professor Davis, who taught economics, became a particularly important mentor. After I catered a department luncheon that earned rave reviews, he stayed to help clean up and asked detailed questions about my business model. Most students see cooking as a way to earn quick cash, he observed as we packed up the serving platters. You're approaching it as a strategic business with long-term potential. That's unusual and valuable. He invited me to participate in a special independent study project, helping me develop a comprehensive business plan for a future catering operation. Under his guidance, I learned to apply the intuitive resource management I'd learned from my parents to formal business structures. What you understand instinctively about value creation and resource allocation, he told me, most MBA students never grasp despite years of theoretical study. I graduated in 1975 with not just a business degree, but a clear vision for my future. Rather than pursuing corporate opportunities like many classmates, I returned to Western Pennsylvania. Not to Pinecrest, but to Pittsburgh, where I rented a small commercial kitchen space and launched Caldwell Catering with the savings I'd accumulated. Throughout college, the first years were lean but educational. I built a reputation for reliability and quality at accessible prices, targeting mid-market clients underserved by existing caterers who focused either on basic bulk food or high-end luxury events. My niche, sophisticated food that honored traditional flavors while bringing innovative presentation to the table, gradually attracted a loyal clientele of professionals, small businesses, and community organizations. By 1978, Caldwell Catering had grown enough to hire 2 assistants and move to a larger kitchen facility. That same year, I met James Harrington at a business association dinner I was catering. He wasn't like the other executives in attendance. While they focused on networking, he spent time asking thoughtful questions about the food, noting the careful balance of flavors and creative use of seasonal ingredients. This butternut squash soup, he said, holding his spoon aloft, has the perfect balance of sweetness and savory notes. And I detect a hint of something unexpected. Apple, perhaps? I was impressed by his perceptive palate. Apple and a touch of curry powder, I confirmed. It adds complexity without overwhelming the squash. James was a young investment banker with family connections in the restaurant industry. His grandfather had owned a steakhouse in Chicago, and he had grown up appreciating good food without knowing how to create it himself. Our conversation that evening sparked both a personal and professional connection that would change the trajectory of my business. 6 months later, James proposed both marriage and a business partnership. He recognized the potential to expand Caldwell Catering into a full-service restaurant that would showcase my approach to cuisine, while his business acumen and connections could provide the capital and clientele to make it successful. We opened Harvest Table in 1980, transforming a former hardware store in Pittsburgh's emerging cultural district into a warm, inviting space that emphasized connection between diners, food, and the people who created it. The open kitchen design was revolutionary for the time, allowing guests to watch as their meals were prepared with care and precision. The restaurant's philosophy, celebrating local ingredients, honoring traditional techniques while embracing thoughtful innovation and creating a genuine sense of hospitality, resonated with diners tired of either pretentious haute cuisine or uninspired chain restaurant fare. We were at the forefront of what would later be called the farm-to-table movement. Though for me, it was simply an extension of how I'd learned to cook in my mother's kitchen, with respect for ingredients and awareness of their origins. Harvest. Table earned critical acclaim and developed a devoted following. By 1983, we had expanded to a second location in the suburbs, and by 1985, we had launched our third restaurant, this one in Philadelphia. Each location maintained the core philosophy while adapting to its specific neighborhood and clientele. James and I welcomed our daughter, Caroline, in 1982, and she quite literally grew up in our restaurants. Her playpen occupied a corner of my office, and she learned to walk in the quiet hours before opening, toddling between tables as staff prepared for service. As she grew older, she absorbed the rhythms and routines of restaurant life, just as naturally as I had once absorbed my mother's lessons about cooking and resourcefulness. The business continued to expand throughout the 1980s, adding locations throughout Pennsylvania and neighboring states. We developed a reputation for consistency and quality that attracted both diners and industry attention. Food and Wine magazine featured our restaurants in 1988, calling our approach a refreshing return to substance over spectacle in an era increasingly dominated by style over culinary integrity. Caroline showed early interest in the business, helping with age-appropriate tasks from setting tables to eventually helping with simple food preparation. She inherited my palate and James's head for numbers, a powerful combination that suggested she might eventually take her place in the family business. But unlike my childhood, where necessity taught discipline and resourcefulness, Caroline grew up with abundance. While we were careful not to spoil her, she never experienced the kind of scarcity that had shaped my relationship with resources. She attended the best schools, traveled extensively, and grew up in environments where excellence was expected, rather than something to be strived for against all odds. In 1995, we incorporated as Harrington Hospitality Group, creating the formal structure that would allow for continued expansion while maintaining quality control across all properties. By this time, we operated 15 restaurants across 5 states, along with a catering division and a small line of specialty food products sold in gourmet shops. Caroline attended Cornell's hotel management program, graduating with honors in 2004. She joined the company immediately, working her way through various operational positions before being named Director of Development in 2007. She met Bradley Matthews, a charming real estate developer specializing in commercial properties, during negotiations for our Chicago location. They married in 2008 and welcomed their daughter, Melissa, in 2010. As the company continued to grow, so did my concerns about maintaining the values that had built our success. Some of our newer properties, particularly those championed by Caroline and Bradley, emphasized design and trendiness in ways that sometimes overshadowed the food and hospitality that had been our foundation. We need to appeal to younger demographics, Caroline would argue during planning meetings. They're looking for experiences and environments they can share on social media, not just good food. There was truth in her perspective, but I worried about balance. The experience should enhance the food, not replace it as the primary focus, I would counter. Trends fade, but quality and genuine hospitality create lasting loyalty. These philosophical differences created occasional tension, but the business continued to thrive, reaching 50 locations by 2020. James and I gradually reduced our day-to-day involvement, though I maintained my position as chair of the board and kept a close eye on quality control and menu development across the brand. By 2023, at 70 years old, I had stepped back from most operational responsibilities while maintaining my ownership stake and board position. Caroline effectively ran daily operations as CEO, while Bradley's influence grew through his position as Chief Development Officer. Together, they represented the public face of Harrington Hospitality Group, while my contributions were increasingly minimized in company narratives and press materials. Which brings us to last month, and the family dinner that would unexpectedly become a turning point in both our family dynamics and business direction. The transition from founder to figurehead happens gradually, like water slowly eroding stone. One day you're making every decision, tasting every dish, greeting every guest, and then, almost imperceptibly, you find yourself being introduced as the woman who started it all by younger executives who speak about your contributions in the past tense while you're standing right beside them. By 2023, Harrington Hospitality Group had grown beyond anything James and I could have imagined when we opened that first restaurant in Pittsburgh. 50 locations across 12 states, a line of retail products in gourmet stores nationwide, and a catering division that handled everything from intimate dinners to corporate galas for thousands. Our annual revenue had surpassed $300 million, and we employed over 3,000 people. James had transitioned gracefully into semi-retirement, focusing on our philanthropic foundation and playing golf 3 times a week with friends who'd been with him since his banking days. His natural diplomatic skills had made the leadership handover to Caroline smooth and celebrated. Industry publications praised the seamless generational transition and the continuing family legacy at Harrington Hospitality. My own transition proved more complicated. Unlike James, who had always managed the business aspects from an office, my work had been centered in the kitchens and dining rooms. Food was not just our product, it was my passion and purpose. Stepping back from menu, development and quality control felt like surrendering a piece of my identity. Caroline approached our company's evolution with characteristic efficiency. After becoming CEO in 2018, she implemented a new corporate structure that centralized decision-making and standardized operations across all locations. Her Harvard MBA and Bradley's real estate expertise created a more sophisticated corporate entity than the family business James and I had built through intuition, hard work, and personal relationships. "We're professionalizing the operation," she would explain during board meetings when I questioned changes that seemed to prioritize efficiency over the hospitality principles that had built our reputation. "The market has evolved, and we need to evolve with it." Bradley, as Chief Development Officer, brought an aggressive expansion strategy that focused on high-profile locations in trendy neighborhoods. His real estate background gave him a keen eye for emerging markets, but his approach to our restaurants sometimes felt more like property development than hospitality. "The physical environment is the first thing guests experience," he would say, presenting elaborate designs for new locations that featured dramatic architecture and Instagram-worthy design elements. "We need to create spaces that make a statement before anyone takes a single bite." There was undeniable success in their approach. New locations opened to considerable fanfare. Reservation lists were filled months in advance, and social media buzzed with photos of signature cocktails and architectural details. But during my visits to these newer properties, I sometimes felt a disconnection from the core values that had built our company. The chefs Caroline hired came with impressive pedigrees from culinary schools and Michelin-starred restaurants, but many lacked the fundamental understanding of value and resourcefulness that had been our foundation. I would walk through kitchens and see excessive waste, perfectly good vegetable trimmings discarded rather than transformed into stocks, expensive ingredients used as mere garnishes, staff focused on plating aesthetics while neglecting flavor development. "That's not how we build flavor," I said during one kitchen visit, watching a young chef discard onion skins and mushroom stems that should have gone into the stock pot. "Those scraps contain essential compounds that create depth in your sauces." The chef gave me a patronizing smile. "We use a standardized base from corporate now, Mrs. Harrington. It ensures consistency across all locations." When I tasted this standardized base, I found it flat and lifeless compared to the complex stocks we had always made in-house, but my feedback was politely acknowledged and effectively ignored. I was becoming a relic, a quaint reminder of the key, old ways rather than a respected voice in the company's future. Caroline's quarterly strategy meetings became exercises in filtered communication. The executive team, mostly MBA graduates in their 30s and 40s, would present carefully prepared slides showing growth metrics and market penetration statistics. When I raised questions about food quality or guest experience, my concerns were met with reassurances that customer satisfaction scores remained high. Our quality assurance team tracks 17 different metrics across all locations, the chief operating officer explained during one such meeting. The data shows consistent performance within acceptable parameters. Acceptable parameters, I repeated, unable to hide my dismay. Is that what we're aiming for now? Acceptable? Caroline smoothly intervened. What Mom means is that we should always strive for excellence, not just acceptance. That's the foundation she built for us, and we're grateful for that institutional wisdom. The way she emphasized institutional made it clear my wisdom was seen as historical rather than current, something to be acknowledged but not necessarily followed. I was being honored rather than heard. This subtle sidelining extended beyond the boardroom. When Food and Wine magazine wanted to do a feature on our company's 40th anniversary in 2020, the PR team arranged for Caroline and Bradley to be photographed in our flagship kitchen, with James and me included almost as an afterthought, seated at a table as if we were guests rather than founders. The article, when published, described me as having established the homey cooking style that the company evolved from before focusing on Caroline's modernization of the brand for today's sophisticated diners. My recipes were described as traditional foundations, while Caroline's menu additions were innovative interpretations for the contemporary palate. Even the company's official history began to change in subtle ways. The narrative increasingly emphasized James's business acumen and downplayed my culinary contributions. References to my growing up in a coal mining town were replaced with more general statements about humble beginnings. My methodical saving and financial discipline, the very foundation that had made our first restaurant possible, was rarely mentioned. I found myself invited to fewer tastings and menu development sessions. When I did attend, my suggestions were met with polite nods followed by explanations of why current market research indicated different approaches would be more successful. Diners today are looking for experiences, not just meals, the newly hired Vice President of Culinary Innovation explained after I questioned the diminishing portion sizes and increasing prices at our urban locations. They're willing to pay more for unique presentations and exclusive ingredients. But are they leaving satisfied? I pressed. Are they feeling nourished and cared for, or just photographed something pretty for their social media? Such questions were typically met with reference to customer satisfaction surveys showing high marks for ambiance and uniqueness, though I noticed the surveys no longer specifically asked about value or whether guests left feeling truly satisfied by their meal. By early 2023, my role had been effectively reduced to that of brand ambassador, attending charity events occasionally, giving interviews about our company's history, and making appearances at new restaurant openings where I would invariably be asked to share charming anecdotes about the early days, rather than my thoughts on the current direction. The personal dynamics within our family echoed these professional changes. Caroline and Bradley had built an expansive home in an exclusive suburb of Philadelphia, where they entertained lavishly and moved in social circles far removed from my coal town origins. My granddaughter Melissa, now 13, was growing up in a world of private schools, summer homes, and European vacations, experiences as foreign to my childhood as fine dining had been in Pinecrest. James and I maintained our primary residence in the comfortable but modest home we had purchased in the 1990s, though we had added a small vacation cottage in the Poconos where I still kept a vegetable garden and canned summer produce for winter use. Habits from my childhood that I never abandoned, despite our financial success. When we visited Caroline's, home for family gatherings, I often found myself gravitating toward the kitchen, more comfortable chopping vegetables alongside the household staff than making small talk with Bradley's business associates in the formal living room. Caroline would inevitably come to collect me, guiding me back to the guests with a gentle but firm hand on my elbow. "Mom, you don't need to help in the kitchen," she would say, her voice a careful blend of affection and exasperation. "That's what we have staff for." I would smile and allow myself to be led away, but we both knew I wasn't in the kitchen out of a sense of obligation. I was there because it remained the place where I felt most authentic, most useful, and most at peace. Melissa seemed caught between these two worlds. She had inherited my interest in cooking, but expressed it through the lens of her privileged upbringing. Exotic ingredients and complicated techniques, rather than the resourceful transformation of humble components that had been my foundation. Still, when she visited our home, she would often join me in the kitchen, curious about the old-fashioned methods I used. "Why do you make stock from scratch when you could just buy it?" she asked once while watching me simmer chicken bones, with vegetable trimmings I had saved throughout the week. "Because this way, nothing is wasted, and the flavor is alive," I explained, lifting the lid so she could inhale the complex aroma. Cooking isn't just about the end result. It's about respecting the process and the ingredients. She considered. This, her expression thoughtful. "But it takes so much time." "Some things are worth the time they take," I said, stirring the golden liquid. "That's something your great-grandmother taught me, and her mother before her." These moments of connection with Melissa gave me hope that some of our family's foundational values might transcend the generational and cultural differences that sometimes created distance between Caroline and me. Despite her privileged upbringing, Melissa showed genuine curiosity about where things came from and how they were made, questions that formed the basis of my own culinary philosophy. In April 2023, Caroline called with news that would set in motion the events leading to that shocking moment in her dining room. "Mom, we're finalizing the guest list for Melissa's 14th birthday dinner," she said. "It's going to be quite special this year. Bradley's arranged for Chef Delacroix from Maison in New York to consult on the menu." Jean-Pierre Delacroix was a celebrity chef known for elaborately plated miniature portions and astronomical prices. Precisely the style of cooking I found most at odds with our company's original values. The fact that Caroline was bringing him in for a teenager's birthday dinner spoke volumes about how far we had drifted from the principles of hospitality I had tried to instill. "That seems excessive for a child's birthday," I observed. "What happened to just having her favorite foods with family?" Caroline's slight pause conveyed her irritation. "It's not just a birthday dinner anymore, Mom. Bradley's invited several key investors and potential partners. We're using the occasion to showcase some concepts for our new development in Boston." The commodification of what should have been a family celebration troubled me, but I had learned to choose my battles. "I see. Well, I'm sure Melissa will enjoy being the center of attention." "Actually, about that," Caroline continued, "we'd love for you to prepare a few of Melissa's favorite dishes from her childhood. Your pot roast, those cinnamon rolls she loves, maybe your potato soup. Jean-Pierre will handle the sophisticated courses, but we thought having some of your comfort food would add a nice personal touch." The request seemed thoughtful on the surface, acknowledging my contribution to Melissa's culinary memories, but the subtext was clear. My cooking would be positioned as nostalgic and quaint alongside the real cuisine prepared by the celebrity chef. "I'd be happy to cook for Melissa," I said, choosing to focus on my granddaughter rather than the implied hierarchy. "Just let me know how many people to prepare for." "Wonderful. It will be about 35 guests. And don't worry about quantity. Your dishes will be offered as heritage options alongside the main menu, so not everyone will choose them." After disconnecting, I sat with the complicated emotions this conversation had stirred. On one hand, I was pleased to cook for my granddaughter's celebration. On the other, being positioned as the provider of quaint heritage options felt diminishing. Another subtle reminder that my approach to food was seen as outdated rather than foundational. Still, I began planning the dishes with care, focusing on the joy of creating something meaningful for Melissa, rather than the politics surrounding the event. I ordered the specific cut of beef I preferred for pot roast, selected potatoes from a local farm for the soup, and ensured I had the highest quality cinnamon for the rolls my granddaughter had loved since she was small. 3 days before the dinner, Caroline called again. "Mom, I've been thinking about the menu. Could you actually prepare a few additional dishes? Bradley mentioned that several guests have expressed interest in trying your home-style cooking." "What did you have in mind?" I asked, mentally calculating. "How to manage more dishes while maintaining quality." "Well, your fried chicken has always been popular, and maybe those buttermilk biscuits. Oh, and Bradley specifically requested your apple pie. He was telling the Andersons about it, and now they're eager to try it." By the time the conversation ended, my few dishes had expanded to 8, each labor-intensive and requiring careful timing. I reworked my preparation schedule, knowing I would need to begin cooking 2 days in advance to ensure everything was perfect. The day before the dinner, Caroline called once more. "Mom, I hate to ask, but could you possibly add a few more items? Jean-Pierre feels the menu needs more balance, and we thought your dishes could provide that contrast." My cooking list grew to 12 items, then 15, and finally 18 distinct dishes, each representing hours of careful preparation and decades of refined technique disguised as simple home cooking. What had begun as a request to prepare a few favorite dishes for my granddaughter had expanded into catering a substantial portion of a sophisticated dinner party, albeit positioned as the traditional counterpoint to the celebrity chef's creations. On the day of the dinner, I arrived at Caroline and Bradley's home 5 hours early, my car filled with partially prepared dishes that would need finishing in their kitchen. I had spent the previous 2 days cooking almost continuously, determined that each dish, however it might be positioned in the overall event, would represent the best of what I could create. The kitchen was already bustling with activity. Jean-Pierre and his team of 3 assistants occupied the central workspace, arranging microscopic garnishes with tweezers and discussing plate designs with the intensity of gallery curators planning an exhibition. They barely acknowledged my arrival, moving aside just enough for me to unload my containers onto a small prep table in the corner. "Mrs. Harrington, you can use this section," the kitchen manager said, gesturing to a cramped area near the pantry. "We've cleared some space in the second refrigerator for your items." The slight hesitation before items conveyed volumes about the hierarchy at play. I thanked her politely and began organizing my work, adjusting to the limited space without complaint. Over the next several hours, I methodically finished each dish, warming the pot roast to perfect tenderness, baking the rolls and biscuits to golden perfection, adding the final touches to pies and cobblers that had been family favorites for generations. The kitchen staff moved around me as if I were a piece of furniture, occasionally glancing curiously at my methods but never engaging directly. Jean-Pierre himself never spoke to me, though I occasionally caught him watching with thinly veiled condescension as I used my hands to feel when dough had reached the right consistency or lifted a spoon to taste and adjust seasoning without measuring. At 6 o'clock, guests began to arrive. From my position in the kitchen, I could hear the growing buzz of conversation in the dining room and adjacent spaces. Caroline appeared briefly, looking elegant in a designer dress to check on preparations. "Everything on schedule?" she asked. Jean-Pierre, who responded with a detailed timeline of his courses and plating arrangements. When she turned to me, her question was simpler. "All set with your dishes, Mom?" "Yes, everything's ready," I confirmed. "Should I begin bringing them out to the buffet area?" A flicker of discomfort crossed her face. "Actually, we've decided to serve your dishes family style at the table rather than on the buffet. The staff will handle getting everything out at the appropriate times." She disappeared before I could respond, leaving me with the sense that plans had changed without my knowledge. I continued my preparations, ensuring each dish was perfect and properly labeled for the serving staff. By 7:30, all 18 of my dishes were complete, a comprehensive showcase of traditional American cooking elevated through technique and quality ingredients rather than pretension. The aromas filled the kitchen with a complex symphony that spoke of comfort, care, and generations of accumulated wisdom. As Jean-Pierre's team began the elaborate plating of their first course, Caroline returned to the kitchen, now accompanied by Bradley. His face showed the slight flush that indicated he'd already enjoyed several cocktails, and his greeting was effusive. "Margaret! There you are, hard at work as always. Everything smells absolutely magnificent." "Thank you, Bradley. Everything is ready whenever you'd like it served." Caroline glanced at her watch. "We're running just slightly behind schedule. Mom, why don't you get cleaned up and join everyone in the dining room? We're about to be seated." I nodded, grateful for the opportunity to finally transition from cook to guest. I quickly washed up, removed my apron, and smoothed my dress. A simple but elegant outfit I had carefully selected for my granddaughter's celebration. When I entered the dining room a few minutes later, I found a scene of orchestrated elegance. The long table gleamed with fine china and crystal, elaborate floral arrangements created a canopy of color down its center, and 35 guests in formal attire were finding their assigned seats. I looked for my name card, moving slowly around the perimeter of the table as the guests settled in. I checked each place setting twice, thinking I must have missed my seat, but gradually realized the uncomfortable truth. There was no place for me at the table. As I stood uncertainly near the kitchen door, Bradley approached with a wine glass in hand. "Everything all right, Margaret?" "I seem to be missing a seat," I said quietly, not wanting to create a scene at Melissa's birthday dinner. A flicker of something, embarrassment, annoyance, crossed his face before he regained his smooth hosting demeanor. "Ah, yes, bit of a last-minute adjustment with the seating. We had more confirmations than expected, and with Jean-Pierre and his key staff joining us at the table." He gestured vaguely. "Caroline thought you wouldn't mind taking your plate in the breakfast nook since you've been on your feet cooking all day anyway. More comfortable, really." The breakfast nook was a small table in an alcove off the kitchen, completely separated from the main dining room by a butler's pantry. I would be not just at a different table, but entirely removed from the celebration I had spent days helping to prepare. Before I could respond, the serving staff began to bring out the first of Jean-Pierre's creations. Tiny compositions of rare ingredients arranged with architectural precision on oversized white plates. Bradley patted my arm and moved away to take his seat at the head of the table, leaving me standing alone near the kitchen entrance. Caroline was busy ensuring her important guests were properly seated and didn't notice my isolation until she happened to glance in my direction several minutes later. She quickly crossed the room, her smile fixed but her eyes conveying annoyance. "Mom, why aren't you sitting down? Your place is set in the breakfast nook. I thought you'd appreciate a quieter space after being on your feet cooking all day." The practiced concern in her voice didn't mask the reality. I had been relegated to a separate space because I didn't fit the image she and Bradley wanted to present to their guests. After preparing 18 dishes for their dinner, dishes they were prominently featuring as part of their hospitality showcase, I wasn't deemed appropriate for inclusion at my own granddaughter's birthday celebration. I looked past Caroline to the table where Melissa sat with an expression of practiced sophistication that didn't quite hide the uncertainty of a 14-year-old trying to navigate an adult world. She caught my eye briefly, offering a small smile that contained both affection and apologetic awareness of the situation. In that moment, something shifted within me. This wasn't just about a seat at a dinner table, it was about respect, recognition, and the values that had built not just our business but my entire approach to life. I had allowed myself to be incrementally sidelined, watching as the principles of genuine hospitality, resourcefulness, and respect for food and people that had built our company were gradually replaced by image, exclusivity, and superficial trends. "Caroline," I said quietly, "I need to speak with you and Bradley privately for a moment. It's important." Her eyes widened slightly at my tone, recognizing a firmness that she hadn't heard from me in some time. "Mom, we're just about to start dinner. Can it wait until later? No, I said simply. It cannot wait. Something in my expression must have conveyed the seriousness of my request, because she nodded slightly and motioned for Bradley to join us. The three of us stepped into the hallway outside the dining room, far enough away to be private, but close enough that I could still see the table and guests. What's so urgent? Bradley asked, clearly annoyed at being pulled away from his hosting duties. I took a deep breath, centering myself for what I was about to do. I've made a decision. I'll be joining the table for dinner this evening. Caroline's brow furrowed. Mom, we've explained the seating situation. There physically isn't. I'll be joining the table, I repeated calmly. Because it would be inappropriate for the majority owner of Harrington Hospitality Group to be excluded from a dinner where her company's legacy and future are being discussed. With potential investors. The color drained from both their faces. Bradley recovered first, his banker's instincts kicking in as he recalibrated to this unexpected turn. Majority owner, Caroline is CEO and I'm Chief Development Officer. The company ownership is... He trailed off, suddenly uncertain. The company ownership, I continued in the same calm voice, is governed by the shareholder agreement James and I established in 2015, when we restructured in preparation for succession planning. I hold 51% of voting shares, with James retaining 15%. The remaining 34% is divided among other shareholders, including the 20% allocated to Caroline. Caroline stared at me, shock evident in her expression. But the board votes? The operational control? The board approves management decisions and operational plans, yes. And I've allowed you significant latitude in your roles as executives. But ultimate control of the company remains with me as majority shareholder. The implications of this statement visibly rippled through them both. They had been operating under the assumption, one I had allowed them to maintain through my gradual withdrawal from active management, that their executive titles gave them ultimate authority over the company's direction. So, you see, I continued, it would be quite unusual for me to be seated in a separate room while discussions about my company's future take place at the main table. Don't you agree? Bradley's face had gone from shocked to calculating, his mind clearly racing through the ramifications of this revelation. Of course, Margaret. There's been a misunderstanding. We'll have a place set for you immediately. Caroline remained frozen, processing not just the information, but what it revealed about her understanding of our family and business dynamics over the past several years. Excellent, I said with a smile that felt, for the first time in many months, completely genuine. And after dinner, we should schedule a proper meeting to discuss several aspects of the company's direction that I believe require realignment with our founding principles. As Bradley hurried off to arrange a place for me at the table, displacing one of the junior staff members from Jean-Pierre's team in the process, Caroline finally found her voice. Why didn't you ever say anything? She asked, a complex mixture of emotions playing across her face. I was hoping I wouldn't have to, I replied gently. I wanted you to succeed on your own terms, to find your own way of carrying forward the values that built our company. But I've watched as those values have been gradually replaced, and I've remained silent too long. Before she could respond, Melissa appeared in the hallway, concern evident in her expression. Is everything okay? People are wondering what's happening. I smiled at my granddaughter, seeing in her face echoes of myself at that age. Curious, perceptive, and more aware of undercurrents than adults often realized. Everything is fine, sweetheart. There's just been a small confusion about the seating arrangements. I'll be joining you at the table after all. She brightened immediately. Really? That's great. I wanted you with us. Caroline watched this exchange with an expression I couldn't quite read, perhaps recognizing for the first time how her careful social engineering had affected family bonds beyond her immediate concerns about business image. As we prepared to return to the dining room where Bradley was now overseeing the hasty addition of another place setting at the table, I placed a gentle hand on Caroline's arm. This evening is about celebrating Melissa, and I won't disrupt that further. But tomorrow, we begin a new chapter in how Harrington hospitality honors its foundations while building its future. I hope you'll be an essential part of that process. With that, I straightened my shoulders and walked into the dining room, where 35 distinguished guests were about to learn that the old-fashioned grandmother, relegated to kitchen duty, had actually funded their entire culinary empire and still owned controlling interest in every restaurant bearing the Harrington name. Some lessons about respecting your elders can't be taught with gentle reminders alone. I've always believed that true power doesn't come from making people feel small, but from helping them recognize their own potential. As I took my newly arranged seat at the center of the dining table, hastily placed between a venture capitalist from Boston and the food editor of Philadelphia magazine, I had no desire to embarrass Caroline or Bradley further. This evening was still, at its heart, a celebration for my granddaughter Melissa. The sudden silence that had fallen across the table when I approached gradually gave way to resumed conversations, though with a noticeably different tenor. The guests, attuned to shifts in social dynamics as successful people often are, sensed that something significant had transpired. Several who had barely acknowledged my presence earlier now made deliberate efforts to engage me in conversation. "Mrs. Harrington, I've been hearing wonderful things about your cooking all evening," said Elaine Winters, the magazine editor seated to my right. "Bradley tells me you're the culinary genius behind the original Harrington restaurant concepts." "That's very kind," I replied, noting how my role had suddenly been upgraded from quaint family cook to culinary genius in the span of minutes, though I'd say it was less about genius and more about understanding fundamental principles of hospitality. Down the table, I could see Jean-Pierre Delacroix watching our interaction with poorly concealed annoyance. His elaborately plated first course, something involving foam, molecular caviar, and edible flowers, was being served with theatrical flourish by his team of assistants. "The heart of good cooking isn't complexity," I continued, raising my voice slightly to ensure it carried. "It's understanding your ingredients, respecting traditional techniques, and never forgetting that the purpose of a meal is to nourish both body and spirit." Several heads nodded in agreement, including, I was pleased to note, that of Richard Anderson, whose investment firm controlled substantial interests in 3 competing restaurant groups. The servers began bringing out my dishes alongside Jean-Pierre's creations, creating a striking visual contrast. His offerings were architectural and precious, tiny portions arranged with mathematical precision on oversized plates. My food was abundant and inviting: platters of golden fried chicken, a Dutch oven of bubbling beef pot roast, baskets of freshly baked biscuits releasing clouds of buttery steam. I watched with quiet satisfaction as guests began serving themselves, many taking more generous portions from my offerings than the carefully measured bites presented by the celebrity chef. The room filled with the sound of appreciative murmurs and genuine conversation as people responded to food that invited sharing and interaction rather than reverent contemplation. Caroline, seated across from me, maintained her composure admirably, though I could see the tight set of her jaw as she observed the scene unfolding. Bradley, at the head of the table, had recovered his hosting persona and was now discussing my culinary background with animation, as if he had always been my greatest champion. Margaret's approach to regional American cuisine was revolutionary when we first opened Harvest Table, he explained to the guests nearest him. She understood farm-to-table decades before it became trendy. Her philosophy has always been the foundation of our brand identity. I caught his eye as he said this, and he had the grace to look momentarily abashed before continuing his revisionist history of our company's development. Melissa, watching from her place of honor at the opposite end of the table, seemed both confused and intrigued by the shifting dynamics. When there was a lull in conversation, she spoke up with the directness that only adolescents can truly master. "Grandma, is it true you own the whole company?" Dad always talks about it like it's his and Mom's. The question landed like a stone, in still water, creating ripples of awkward silence that spread across the table. Bradley nearly choked on his wine, while Caroline closed her eyes briefly as if gathering strength. I smiled at my granddaughter, appreciating her honesty. Not the whole company, sweetheart. Your parents and other shareholders own portions of it. But yes, I am the majority owner, which means I have the final say in major decisions. Cool, she said with a grin. So you're like the boss of Mom and Dad at work? A few nervous chuckles broke out around the table. Caroline interjected quickly. It's more complicated than that, Melissa. Corporate governance involves boards of directors, executive management. Actually, I interrupted gently, in the simplest terms, yes. Though I've chosen to let your parents handle day-to-day operations while I focus on other aspects of our company's development. This framing, that my reduced role had been my choice rather than their systematic sidelining, allowed Caroline and Bradley to save face while still establishing the truth. It was a courtesy extended not out of weakness, but from the strength of knowing exactly where I stood. The remainder of the dinner proceeded with a fascinating undercurrent of recalibration. Conversations about the company's future now included deferential glances in my direction. Jean-Pierre's elaborate descriptions of his courses became noticeably less condescending. And several of the investors Bradley had been courting made pointed efforts to engage directly with me about my vision for the brand's evolution. As dessert was served, my handcrafted apple pie alongside Jean-Pierre's deconstructed panna cotta, with nitrogen-frozen berry dust, I found myself seated next to Richard Anderson, who had deliberately changed places to speak with me. Mrs. Harrington, I hope you'll forgive my directness, but I've been examining investment opportunities in your sector for some time, he said in a low voice that wouldn't carry to the rest of the table. Your company has shown impressive growth, but I've had reservations about its current direction. I nodded, encouraging him to continue. There's been a noticeable shift in the Harrington brand identity over the past few years, moving upmarket certainly, but also losing some of the distinctive character that originally set it apart. He gestured toward my apple pie, which guests were enthusiastically serving in generous portions. This evening has been illuminating in that regard. How so, Mr. Anderson? Let's just say I'm now more interested in discussing potential partnerships than I was when I arrived. He smiled, sliding a business card alongside my dessert plate. Perhaps we could arrange a conversation without quite so many competing voices present. By the time coffee was served, the evening had transformed from what was meant to be my relegation to the kitchen into what effectively became my reintroduction as the company's guiding force. It wasn't what I had planned when I arrived with my car full of carefully prepared dishes, but sometimes opportunities present themselves in unexpected moments. As guests began to depart around 11, offering effusive compliments on both the meal and the evening, I found myself in a quiet corner with Melissa, who had sought me out deliberately. I didn't know all that stuff about you owning the company, she said, her young face serious. Mom and Dad never talk about that part. There's a lot about the family history that doesn't come up in everyday conversation, I replied. Perhaps that's something we should change, she nodded thoughtfully. I liked your food better than the fancy chefs, she confided. His stuff looked cool for Instagram but didn't taste like it was made with love, you know? The simple observation brought tears to my eyes. Despite all the sophisticated business positioning and brand evolution, this 14-year-old had intuitively recognized the fundamental difference between cuisine designed to impress and food created to nourish. That's the best birthday gift you could have given me, I told her, pulling her into a hug. Understanding the difference. After the last guest had departed, Caroline, Bradley, and I found ourselves alone in the living room. The staff was busy cleaning up in the kitchen and dining room, while Melissa had gone upstairs to call friends about her eventful birthday dinner. The silence between us was heavy with unspoken tensions and recalibrations. After several moments, Caroline spoke first. You could have told us at any point over the past 5 years that you were still the controlling shareholder, she said, her voice carefully neutral. Why wait until tonight to reveal it? Would it have made a difference? I asked. Or would you have simply worked harder to manage me while continuing on your chosen path? Her lack of immediate denial was answer enough. I didn't want to assert control through legal mechanisms, I continued. I wanted you to recognize the value in our founding principles organically, to understand why creating genuine hospitality matters more than chasing trends or impressing investors. Bradley, somewhat recovered from the evening's revelations, attempted to reframe the situation. Margaret, no one has ever questioned the importance of your original vision. We've simply been evolving it for contemporary markets. The fundamentals remain intact. Do they? I countered. When was the last time you spent a day in one of our kitchens, Bradley? Not for a photo opportunity or a quick tour, but actually working alongside the staff? When did you last observe how much food is wasted? How many corners are cut to meet the efficiency metrics your management consultants have established? He had no answer, confirming what I already knew. His understanding of our business remained largely theoretical, focused on spreadsheets and property values, rather than the lived experience of creating genuine hospitality. Tomorrow morning, I said, I'd like the three of us to meet at our original Harvest Table location in Pittsburgh. I've arranged for the executive team to join us there at 11. It's time we realigned on what Harrington hospitality truly represents. Caroline's expression showed both concern and curiosity. Are you planning to make organizational changes? I'm planning to remind everyone, including myself, why we succeeded in the first place, I replied. The specific changes will flow from that foundation. The following morning dawned clear and crisp, a perfect spring day in Philadelphia. James and I had breakfast together in our home, discussing the events of the previous evening and the path forward. Are you sure you want to take a more active role again? He asked, concerned about the stress it might place on me at 70. We've earned our retirement, Maggie. It's not about returning to daily operations, I explained. It's about ensuring the soul of what we built isn't lost in the pursuit of expansion and trends. Once that foundation is secure, I'll be happy to step back again, but with proper guardrails in place. He nodded, understanding as he always had. I'll back whatever you decide. Just remember that Caroline has her strengths too, different from yours, but valuable in their own way. This was why our partnership had worked for over 40 years. His ability to see multiple perspectives while supporting my core convictions had provided balance during even the most challenging transitions. We arrived at the Pittsburgh restaurant an hour before the scheduled meeting. The original Harvest Table had been renovated several times over the decades, each update gradually moving it further from its initial character. What had once been a warm, inviting space with an open kitchen and simple quality furnishings had evolved into something more self-consciously designed, full of Instagram-worthy vignettes and trendy materials that already showed signs of dating. Had arranged for the restaurant to remain closed until lunch service, giving us private access to the space. Caroline and Bradley arrived promptly at 10, followed shortly by the executive team. 8 senior leaders who oversaw various aspects of our now substantial corporate operation, rather than heading to the private dining room where meetings were typically held. I led the group into the kitchen, a space many of the executives rarely visited. Several looked uncomfortable in the working environment, carefully avoiding contact with equipment or surfaces in their expensive business attire. Before we begin formal discussions, I'd like us to prepare a meal together, I announced, gesturing to the ingredients I had arranged on the central workstation. Nothing elaborate, just a simple breakfast service for ourselves. The confusion on their faces might have been comical under different circumstances. The chief marketing officer glanced at her silk blouse with barely concealed horror, while the CFO examined his French cuffs as if calculating the replacement cost. Mom, we can have the kitchen staff prepare something if you're hungry, Caroline said, clearly puzzled by this approach. This isn't about hunger, I replied. It's about understanding. You can't properly direct a hospitality company if you've forgotten what it means to create hospitality with your own hands. Over the next hour, I guided this group of highly paid executives through the preparation of a simple but complete breakfast. Service. I assigned tasks based on what I thought each needed to learn. Caroline cracked eggs and made hollandaise sauce from scratch, experiencing the patience required to create something that couldn't be rushed. Bradley kneaded dough for biscuits, feeling how the texture changed through the work of his own hands. The chief operations officer, who had recently implemented efficiency standards that had increased food waste, was tasked with extracting maximum value from a case of oranges for fresh juice. Some took to their assignments with good-natured curiosity. Others remained stiffly uncomfortable, clearly counting the minutes until we could return to more familiar territory of PowerPoints and financial projections. But all participated, gradually becoming more engaged as the meal took shape through their collective efforts. When everything was ready, we carried our creation to the dining room and seated ourselves around a central table, not in the hierarchical arrangement typical of our meetings, but in the communal style of the family meals that had once been a daily tradition in all our restaurants. Now, I said as we began to eat, we can talk about the future of Harrington hospitality. Over the next 2 hours, I shared my vision for reconciling the company's growth ambitions with its founding principles. This wasn't about returning to the past or rejecting innovation. It was about ensuring that innovation served our core purpose, rather than replacing it. Our success was never primarily about the food, I explained, watching recognition dawn on some faces. The food was the medium through which we delivered something more fundamental, the feeling of being genuinely cared for, of being seen as a person, not just a customer, of experiencing abundance that nourishes rather than excess that merely impresses. I outlined specific changes I wanted to implement immediately. A return to scratch cooking in all locations rather than relying on standardized bases and pre-prepared components. A renewed emphasis on reducing waste through creative use of ingredients. A revision of portion sizes to emphasize satisfaction rather than artificial scarcity or overwhelming abundance. And most importantly, a reconnection between management and the daily reality of creating hospitality. Every executive in this room will spend 1 week per quarter working in our restaurants, not observing, not directing, but actually doing the work alongside our staff, I stated, meeting each person's eyes in turn, washing dishes, prepping vegetables, serving customers, experiencing firsthand the systems you create and the decisions you make from boardrooms. The CFO began to object, citing scheduling difficulties and the inefficiency of such an arrangement, but I raised a hand to stop him. "This isn't a suggestion," I said quietly. "This is a condition of continued employment with Harrington Hospitality. We've lost touch with our purpose, and this is how we'll reconnect." By the time we finished our meeting, a framework for significant change had been established. Caroline, to her credit, had engaged thoughtfully once she moved past her initial defensiveness. Her organizational skills and strategic thinking would be essential for implementing these changes effectively across our now substantial operation. Bradley remained more resistant, particularly to the hands-on requirements and shift away from the high-profile, design-focused expansion he had championed. I made a mental note to have a separate conversation with him about whether his goals and the company's realigned direction remained compatible. As the executives departed to prepare for the restaurant's opening for lunch service, Caroline lingered behind. She waited until we were alone before speaking. "I owe you an apology, Mom," she said, her professional facade softening. "Not just for last night, but for how I've gradually pushed you to the sidelines over the past few years. I convinced myself it was to protect you from stress, to let you enjoy retirement. But that wasn't entirely true." "What was the true reason?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew. She looked away, gathering her thoughts. "I wanted to prove I could do it my way, that I wasn't just following a path you created, but building something of my own." She met my eyes again. I didn't realize I was dismantling the very things that made us special in the process. The honesty of this admission touched me deeply. Creating something of your own is natural and right, I told her. But innovation is most powerful when it builds on a strong foundation rather than replacing it. How do we move forward from here? She asked. I don't want to just go back to how things were before I took over as CEO, but I recognize we've lost something essential. We don't go back, I assured her. We move forward with clearer purpose. Your skills, your business training, your understanding of modern markets, your organizational abilities, these are tremendous assets, but they need to serve our core mission rather than defining it. Over the following months, Harrington Hospitality underwent a transformation that the industry press would later describe as revolutionary, precisely because it involved returning to fundamental principles rather than chasing the next trend. We didn't abandon the growth and modernization that Caroline and Bradley had championed, but we recentered it around the values that had built our success. The most visible changes happened in our kitchens and dining rooms. We reinstated scratch cooking across all locations, eliminating the standardized bases and pre-prepared components that had gradually homogenized our offerings. Portion sizes were adjusted to emphasize satisfaction rather than either artificial scarcity or excessive abundance. And perhaps most significantly, we reconnected each restaurant with its local community and suppliers, moving away from the corporate uniformity that had begun to make our locations indistinguishable from one another. Behind the scenes, the executive team's quarterly immersion in restaurant operations created a profound shift in corporate culture. Policies began to reflect operational realities rather than theoretical efficiencies. Management bonuses were restructured to reward sustainability and staff retention alongside financial metrics. And decision-making processes were revised to include input from line cooks and servers alongside data analytics. Bradley struggled with these changes more than Caroline. His vision for the company had been firmly focused on high-profile urban locations and design-centric dining experiences. After several months of evident frustration, he accepted an offer to lead development for a luxury hotel group, an amicable separation that allowed him to pursue his interests while maintaining family harmony. Caroline, though initially concerned about managing without her partner of 15 years, gradually recognized that their professional styles had become increasingly incompatible. Melissa, perhaps surprisingly, became one of the most enthusiastic supporters of our renewed direction. At 14, she was at the perfect age to absorb the lessons of this transition. She began spending weekends and school breaks working in various restaurants, learning the business from the ground up as I had once done, though under very different circumstances than my Coal Town childhood. I think I want to go to culinary school after high school, she told me during one of our now regular cooking sessions in my home kitchen. Not just to learn techniques, but to understand food traditions from different cultures. That sounds like a wonderful foundation, I replied, showing her how to properly knead dough for the cinnamon rolls we were preparing. Though remember that some of the most important lessons happen outside formal education. She nodded thoughtfully, concentrating on the rhythmic motion of folding and pressing the dough. Like this, learning from you. These are the things that aren't in cookbooks. 6 months after that revelatory dinner at Caroline's home, we gathered again to celebrate, this time at the original Harvest Table location in Pittsburgh, recently refreshed to better reflect its heritage while still appearing contemporary and welcoming. The occasion was officially the 43rd anniversary of our first restaurant opening, but unofficially, it was a celebration of renewal and recommitment to our founding principles. The guest list was deliberately diverse. Investors and executives sat alongside chefs and servers from across our company. James and I had insisted that representatives from every level of the organization be included, reinforcing the message that genuine hospitality begins with how we treat each other. As I looked around the room during dinner, I felt a deep satisfaction in what we had accomplished. The food being served came from recipes I had developed decades earlier, but with subtle contemporary touches added by our current culinary team. A perfect representation of honoring foundations while embracing thoughtful innovation. Caroline, now fully embracing her role as CEO within our renewed framework, stood to offer a toast. 43 years ago, my parents opened this restaurant with a simple but powerful vision: to create food that nourished both body and spirit, and to offer hospitality that made every guest feel genuinely valued. She raised her glass, looking directly at me. We lost sight of that vision for a time, distracted by trends and growth metrics. But thanks to my mother's courage and wisdom, we've found our way back to what matters most. To Margaret Harrington, who taught us that sometimes the most innovative path forward is remembering why you started in the first place. As glasses were raised around the room, I thought about the journey that had brought us to this moment. From my mother's kitchen in a struggling coal town to a restaurant empire, now recommitted to its core values. The path hadn't been straight or easy, but each challenge and detour had ultimately strengthened both our business and our family. Later that evening, as the celebration continued around us, Richard Anderson, who had indeed become a significant investor in our company following that fateful birthday dinner, approached me with a smile. "You've accomplished something remarkable here, Margaret," he said, gesturing to the vibrant scene around us. "Most companies lose their soul as they grow, particularly through generational transitions. You've managed to restore yours." "It's a continuous process," I replied, "not something you accomplish once and consider complete." He nodded in agreement. "That's why I ultimately invested. Not because of your market position or growth projections, though those are certainly strong. I invested because you understand that sustainable success isn't about chasing trends or maximizing short-term returns. It's about creating genuine value that stands the test of time." As the evening wound down, I found myself in a quiet corner with Melissa, who had been observing the proceedings with unusual thoughtfulness for a teenager. "What are you thinking about so intently?" I asked her. "I was just wondering what it will be like when it's my turn to lead the company someday," she replied. "If I'll remember all the lessons from tonight when I'm Mom's age." The question revealed a maturity that touched me deeply. "The specific challenges will be different in your generation," I told her. "But the fundamental principles won't change. Respect for ingredients and people, creating genuine value rather than just the appearance of it, and remembering that true hospitality comes from the heart, not a marketing strategy." She considered this for a moment. "And if I forget, will you have to make me cook 18 dishes and then reveal you still own the company?" Her eyes twinkled with mischief. I laughed, pulling her into a hug. "I hope that won't be necessary. But if it is, remember that some lessons about respecting your elders can't be taught with gentle reminders alone." As we embraced, I caught Caroline's eye across the room. She raised her glass in a private toast, acknowledging the journey we had taken together, not just in rebuilding our company's foundation, but in healing the fractures in our family that had formed along the way. In that moment, I knew that the true legacy of Harrington Hospitality wouldn't be measured in locations, opened or revenue generated, but in the values that would continue to guide it long after I was gone. And perhaps that's the most any of us can hope to achieve: creating something of genuine worth that outlasts our own brief time at the table. The next time you sit down to a meal, whether in a fine restaurant or at your family kitchen table, remember that what matters isn't the presentation or the price, it's the care that went into creating it and the connections formed while sharing it. That's the lesson I've spent my life learning and teaching, from a coal town kitchen to a culinary empire, and it remains the most valuable ingredient in any dish worth serving. 2 years have passed since that pivotal night when I revealed my ownership of Harrington Hospitality Group. What began as an evening of humiliation, cooking 18 dishes only to be denied a seat at my granddaughter's birthday table, has transformed into one of the most significant turning points not just for our family business, but for my relationship with my daughter and granddaughter. Life has a way of coming full circle. Last week, I celebrated my 72nd birthday in the original Harvest Table restaurant in Pittsburgh. Unlike Melissa's elaborate birthday with celebrity chefs and business associates, my celebration was intentionally intimate, just family, and a few close friends who had been part of our journey from the beginning. The most meaningful gift came not in a wrapped package, but in the form of an announcement from Caroline. "Mom," she said, standing to address our small gathering after the main course had been served. "2 years ago, you reminded us what matters most in this business and in life. Today, I'm proud to announce that Harrington Hospitality has been named Restaurant Group of the Year by Hospitality Excellence magazine." A cheer went up from our table, but Caroline raised her hand to continue. The judges specifically cited our revolutionary return to foundational values while maintaining contemporary relevance as the reason for the award. She smiled, her eyes meeting mine. They praised our scratch cooking philosophy, our waste reduction initiatives, our employee development programs, and our community integration. All principles you fought to restore when the rest of the industry was moving in the opposite direction. She handed me the advance copy of the magazine, which featured a striking cover photo. Not of our most photogenic restaurant interior or an elaborate culinary creation, but of 3 generations of Harrington, women cooking together in my home kitchen. The image captured Melissa, Caroline, and me making my mother's cinnamon rolls, our hands dusted with flour, expressions of concentration and joy on our faces. The headline read, "The Harrington Revolution: How Going Back to Basics Moved a Restaurant." Empire Forward. As I looked at the photograph, I felt the presence of my own mother, Evelyn from Coletown Pinecrest, whose lessons about creating value from humble ingredients had shaped my entire approach to cooking and business. The legacy had come full circle, passing from her to me, from me to Caroline, and now to Melissa. The journey to this moment had not been without its challenges, of course. Transforming a company with 50 locations and thousands of employees doesn't happen overnight, even with clear directive from the majority owner. The months following my revelation had required careful navigation of both business realities and family dynamics. Bradley's departure had created both challenges and opportunities. While Caroline initially struggled with managing both their personal separation and the professional realignment, his absence ultimately created space for her to develop her own authentic leadership style, rather than the competitive, trend-focused approach they had cultivated together. "I never realized how much our marriage had shaped my professional identity," she confided to me during a quiet dinner at my home about 6 months after he left. "We were so focused on impressing each other and our social circle that I lost sight of what originally made me proud to be part of this company." This new self-awareness had transformed Caroline's leadership approach. Her business acumen and organizational skills, always her strengths, were now aligned with the company's core values rather than working at cross-purposes with them. She had found her own way to honor our foundations while bringing genuine innovation that served our mission rather than replacing it. One of the most significant changes had been the development of our kitchen immersion program. What began as my requirement for executives to spend time working in restaurant operations had evolved into a comprehensive approach to leadership development. Every employee on a management track now cycled through all aspects of restaurant operations, regardless of whether their ultimate role would be in finance, marketing, or administration. "You can't effectively lead what you don't fundamentally understand," became a core principle of our corporate culture, painted on the wall of our headquarters alongside my mother's wisdom. "Waste is just ignorance made visible." The renewed emphasis on scratch cooking and local sourcing had initially met resistance from those concerned about cost control and consistency. Our CFO had presented spreadsheets projecting alarming increases in food costs and labor hours if we eliminated centralized production of bases and sauces. "These projections assume we're simply adding work without gaining any benefits," I pointed out during a tense executive meeting. They don't account for the reduced waste, improved quality, increased customer satisfaction, and enhanced staff engagement that comes from cooking with purpose rather than simply assembling components. To prove the point, I had arranged side-by-side financial analyses of two comparable locations, one operating with the centralized system and another that had already implemented the scratch cooking approach. Despite slightly higher ingredient costs, the scratch cooking location showed better overall profitability due to reduced waste, higher check averages, increased customer return rates, and significantly lower staff turnover. People want to work in kitchens where they're using their skills and creativity, I explained, and they stay longer in jobs where they feel genuine pride in what they create. This last point had proven particularly significant as the restaurant industry continued to struggle with staffing challenges. Our employee retention rates had improved dramatically over the past 2 years, creating stability that translated directly to consistent quality and customer experience. While competitors were constantly training new staff, we were developing and promoting people who understood our culture and values at a deeper level. The most visible manifestation of our renewed direction was the launch of Harvest Academy, HA's training center adjacent to our original Pittsburgh restaurant, where we now develop talent at all levels of the organization. Unlike traditional culinary schools that focused primarily on technical skills, Harvest Academy emphasized the integrated nature of hospitality, teaching not just cooking techniques, but resource management, sustainability practices, and the fundamental philosophy that had built our success. Melissa had become deeply involved in the academy during her school breaks, both as a student and increasingly as a young teacher sharing her unique perspective as the third generation of our family business. At 16, she had developed a special workshop for children from underserved communities, teaching basic cooking skills and nutrition principles through hands-on classes. Not everyone has a grandmother or mother who can teach them to cook, she explained when presenting the program concept. But these skills are fundamental to health, resource management, and even family bonding. Everyone deserves access to this knowledge. Hearing my granddaughter articulate these values, sounding so much like my own mother despite growing up in circumstances of privilege rather than necessity, reinforced my belief that genuine values can transcend generational and economic differences. When transmitted through meaningful experience rather than mere words, the journey hadn't been without setbacks, of course. Some longtime executives had chosen to leave rather than adapt to our renewed direction. A few locations that had been developed primarily for their real estate value rather than operational viability had been sold or repurposed. And we'd faced criticism from some industry voices who viewed our emphasis on fundamentals as regressive rather than revolutionary. The Harringtons are swimming against the tide of modern dining trends, one prominent restaurant critic had written. While competitors embrace molecular gastronomy and virtual dining experiences, they're doubling down on the quaint notion that food should taste good and make people feel genuinely cared for. It remains to be seen whether this nostalgic approach can succeed in today's market. 6 months later, the same critic had published a remarkably different assessment after visiting our redesigned flagship location in Philadelphia. What the Harringtons have achieved defies simple categorization. By recommitting to fundamental culinary principles while thoughtfully incorporating contemporary elements, they've created something that feels simultaneously timeless and thoroughly modern. The food is technically flawless yet emotionally resonant, a combination rarely achieved in today's dining landscape where establishments typically excel at either soulful tradition or technical innovation, but seldom both. This balance, honoring foundations while embracing thoughtful evolution, had become our defining characteristic, not just in our restaurants but in our family dynamics as well. The 3 generations of Harrington women had found a new equilibrium that respected our different perspectives, while recognizing the value each brought to our shared enterprise. Caroline had grown into a leadership style that leveraged her business, acumen, and organizational skills while incorporating the deeper values I had fought to preserve. I had learned to trust her judgment in areas where her expertise exceeded mine, particularly in navigating the complex financial and technological landscape of modern restaurant operations. And Melissa was developing a unique synthesis of both approaches, absorbing lessons from each of us while forming her own perspective, shaped by her generation's particular challenges and opportunities. Our weekly family dinners, now a sacred tradition regardless of how busy our schedules became, provided a forum for both personal connection and professional discussion. These meals were deliberately held in my home kitchen rather than at our restaurants, reinforcing the connection between our business and its familial roots. "I want to talk about something important," Melissa announced during one such dinner, shortly after her 16th birthday. She had been unusually quiet throughout the meal, and both Caroline and I had noticed her pushing food around her plate rather than eating with her typical enthusiasm. "What's on your mind, sweetheart?" Caroline asked, setting down her fork to give her daughter full attention. "I've been thinking a lot about my future with the company," Melissa began carefully. "Everyone assumes I'll eventually take over from Mom, continuing the family legacy into the third generation." I felt a momentary concern, wondering if she was about to announce a completely different career aspiration, perhaps something in technology or medicine that would take her away from the business we had all come to see as her eventual inheritance. "But before that happens," she continued, "I think I need experiences beyond what Harrington Hospitality can provide. I want to really understand food traditions from different cultures, not just from cookbooks or classes, but by living and working in those places." Relief mingled with pride as I understood what she was suggesting. Not a rejection of our family legacy, but a commitment to enriching it through broader experience than either Caroline or I had acquired before taking leadership roles. "I'd like to defer college for a year after high school graduation," she explained, her voice growing more confident as she outlined her plan. "I want to spend time in different culinary traditions, maybe 3 months in Japan learning about precision and seasonal awareness, 3 months in Italy understanding regional preservation techniques, 3 months in Mexico exploring their complex layering of flavors, and 3 months in West Africa studying culinary traditions that have influenced American cooking in ways that aren't always acknowledged." The thoughtfulness of this proposal, specifically selected culinary traditions with clear learning objectives rather than simply a desire to travel, revealed how seriously she was taking her future role in our company. Caroline looked at me, silently seeking my opinion before responding to her daughter. In that exchanged glance, I saw how far we had come in rebuilding trust and mutual respect over the past 2 years. "I think it's an excellent idea," I said. "Understanding diverse culinary traditions firsthand will give you insights that neither your mother nor I had when developing our approach. The perspective you'll gain will be invaluable." Caroline nodded in agreement. "We've always said that Harrington Hospitality should evolve with each generation while honoring its foundations. Your journey could inform the next evolution in meaningful ways." The relief on Melissa's face made it clear she had been preparing for resistance rather than support. "Really? You're both okay with me delaying college and traveling instead?" "More than okay," I assured her. "In fact, I wish I had done something similar at your age. My understanding of food traditions came primarily from cookbooks, and later, experimentation rather than direct immersion in diverse culinary cultures." This conversation reflected how our family dynamics had matured, moving from the tension and control issues that had culminated in that painful birthday dinner to genuine collaboration across generations, each respecting the other's perspectives and contributions. As we continued planning Melissa's culinary journey that evening, I reflected on how differently this might have unfolded if I hadn't taken a stand 2 years earlier. Without that pivotal moment when I revealed my ownership and reasserted our founding principles, we might have continued down a path of increasing disconnection, the business drifting from its foundations while family relationships became increasingly strained by unaddressed tensions. Instead, that difficult moment had created opportunity for genuine transformation, not just in our business operations, but in our understanding of each other and the legacy we were collectively building. The magazine on my birthday table with its cover, photo of 3 generations cooking together, represented more than professional recognition. It captured the essence of what we had achieved, not just a successful business, but a living tradition that could adapt and evolve while remaining true to its foundational values. "The best is yet to come," Caroline had written in my birthday card. Not because we'll be bigger or trendier, but because we now understand what really matters. The journey from that painful night, cooking 18 dishes only to be denied, a seat at the table, to this moment of genuine celebration and recognition had not been easy. It had required courage to assert uncomfortable truths, wisdom to distinguish between essential principles and mere nostalgia, and patience to allow necessary transformations to unfold organically, rather than through forced compliance. As my birthday celebration continued around me, James leaned over to squeeze my hand beneath the table. "Penny for your thoughts?" he asked quietly. "I was just thinking about how things might have unfolded if I hadn't spoken up that night," I replied. "If I had just accepted the breakfast nook and kept quiet about my ownership." He nodded thoughtfully. "Sometimes the most loving thing we can do is create necessary discomfort. You had the courage to do that, even knowing it might temporarily damage relationships." This observation captured something essential about leadership that I had learned over decades building our company. True leadership sometimes requires making others uncomfortable in service of deeper principles. The temporary discord created by challenging comfortable patterns can lead to more authentic harmony if approached with clarity of purpose rather than mere assertion of power. The remainder of my birthday celebration unfolded with a warmth and authenticity that reflected our renewed family and business culture. The food, prepared collaboratively by chefs from across our restaurant group, represented the perfect balance we had achieved. Dishes rooted in traditional techniques and respect for ingredients, but executed with contemporary refinement and presentation. As dessert was served, a sophisticated reimagining of my mother's apple pie with components that honored her waste-nothing approach while incorporating modern techniques, Caroline proposed another toast. 2 years ago, we rediscovered our foundation, she said, raising her glass. Today, we celebrate not just my mother's birthday, but the renewed legacy she fought to preserve when it would have been easier to remain silent. She turned to address me directly. "Mom, when you revealed your ownership that night, you could have simply used your authority to force changes. Instead, you chose the harder path, helping us understand why those changes mattered. You insisted we reconnect with the heart of hospitality through direct experience rather than abstract discussion. That approach has transformed not just our company, but all of us who are part of it." The applause that followed reflected genuine appreciation rather than obligatory acknowledgement. These people, from executive chefs to longtime servers, had experienced firsthand the positive impact of our renewed direction on both our business success and their professional fulfillment. Later that evening, as the celebration wound down and guests began to depart, I found myself in a quiet moment with Richard Anderson, whose investment in our company following that fateful dinner had helped fund many of our transformative initiatives. "I've invested in dozens of restaurant groups over my career," he noted, sipping the last of his coffee. "Most achieve growth or quality, but rarely both sustainably. Few survive generational transitions with their soul intact." "What's different about us?" I asked, genuinely curious about his perspective as someone who had observed countless hospitality businesses from the inside. He considered the question thoughtfully. Most founders either hold on too tightly, preventing necessary evolution, or disengage completely, allowing drift from core principles. You found the balance, providing clear boundaries around non-negotiable values while creating space for genuine innovation within those parameters. This assessment resonated with my own understanding of what we had achieved. The renewed Harrington hospitality wasn't simply a return to past practices. It was a thoughtful integration of foundational principles with contemporary approaches that served our core mission rather than diluting it. As I prepared to leave my birthday celebration, Melissa approached with a small package carefully wrapped in hand-decorated paper. "I made this for you," she said, uncharacteristically shy. "It's not expensive, but I thought it was appropriate." Inside was a hand-bound book titled Recipes That Built Us, a collection she had spent months compiling, featuring dishes that had defined our family and business journey. Each recipe was accompanied by photographs and stories capturing its significance in our history. Most moving were the annotations Melissa had added in her own handwriting, noting what each dish had taught her about cooking and life. Grandma's pot roast taught me that patience transforms the ordinary into the extraordinary. Mom's ratatouille showed me that individual elements retain their identity while creating something greater together. Great-grandmother's cinnamon rolls demonstrated that simple ingredients become magnificent through proper technique and care. The final page contained a recipe Melissa had developed herself, a dish that thoughtfully incorporated elements from each generation while adding her own distinctive perspective. The accompanying note read, "This represents what I hope to create, something that honors where we've come from while contributing something uniquely mine to our continuing story." This gift captured perfectly what we had achieved over the past 2 years. Not just restored relationships or business success, but a living legacy that could evolve while remaining connected to its essential foundations. Driving home that evening, with James, I felt a deep contentment that transcended the professional recognition or business metrics. What mattered most was that the values I had learned in my mother's kitchen in Pinecrest, resourcefulness, respect for ingredients, and understanding that genuine hospitality comes from the heart rather than a marketing strategy, would continue shaping our family and business long after I was gone. "You know what I'm most proud of?" I said to James as we turned onto our street. "Tell me," he replied, reaching over to take my hand. "That we've created something that doesn't depend on my continued ownership or control to maintain its integrity. The values have been embedded deeply enough that they'll continue guiding decisions long after leadership transitions to the next generation and beyond. This, perhaps, is the ultimate test of any legacy, whether it can sustain itself through the inevitable transitions that time brings." The ownership revelation that shocked everyone that night 2 years ago had been necessary in that moment, but the lasting transformation came not from asserting control, but from reconnecting with purpose in ways that allowed others to embrace it authentically rather than through obligation. As we pulled into our driveway, my phone chimed with a message from Caroline. "Thank you for the best lesson you ever taught us. That sometimes going back to basics is the most revolutionary path forward." I smiled, thinking of the journey from Coal Town Kitchen to culinary empire, from being denied a seat at my granddaughter's birthday table, to celebrating my own birthday surrounded by 3 generations united in purpose. The path hadn't been straight or always easy, but each challenge had ultimately strengthened both our business and our family bonds. Some lessons about respecting your elders can't be taught with gentle reminders alone. But the most important lessons aren't about respect for authority. They're about recognizing the value of wisdom earned through experience, the importance of principles that stand the test of time, and the understanding that true innovation builds upon foundations rather than replacing them. As I think back to that night when I shocked everyone by revealing my ownership of the company they had gradually pushed me to the margins of, I realized the most significant outcome wasn't the reassertion of my authority. It was the reconnection with purpose that transformed not just our business operations, but our understanding of the legacy we were collectively building. If you find yourself feeling marginalized or overlooked despite your contributions, whether in family dynamics, workplace relationships, or any other context, remember that true power doesn't come from titles or positions. It comes from clarity of purpose, courage to speak uncomfortable truths when necessary, and commitment to values that transcend temporary trends or convenient compromises. And if you're fortunate enough to create something of value during your lifetime, remember that its preservation doesn't depend on maintaining control. It depends on embedding your foundational principles so deeply that they become self-sustaining, guiding those who follow not through obligation, but through genuine understanding of their enduring worth. The most valuable legacy isn't measured in assets transferred, but in values transmitted. Not just through words, but through meaningful experiences that allow each generation to discover their truth firsthand. That's the lesson I learned in my mother's kitchen in Pinecrest. It's the lesson I fought to preserve in our family business, and it's the lesson I hope will continue guiding Harrington hospitality long after my name is just a note in the company history. After all, the most important dish in any memorable meal isn't what's served on the plate. It's the experience created around the table, the feeling of being genuinely valued, the connections formed through breaking bread together, and the understanding that true nourishment feeds the spirit as much as the body. That's the recipe worth passing down, generation after generation. They made me cook 18 dishes and left me no seat at the table. What I did next shocked them, but what we created together in the aftermath is what truly matters. And that's a story worth sharing with the world. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.